So I'm just going to talk really quickly about feeding your active starter. If you were a bakery and you were baking every day of the week, you would never put this in a refrigerator because you would just always want it to be active and ready for the bread making process. I'm not making bread every day of the week. Probably most people that are at home aren't doing that. So I make sure that I at least feed it once a week and bring it out of the fridge once a week for feeding. Other than that, it can stay in your fridge until you're ready to use it. So there's a couple of things to remember. Because you want the starter to be active whenever you're going to add it to a recipe, whether it's pancakes or a pizza dough or English muffins or just the regular loaf of bread, depending on what you're making, you want to make sure that you're bringing it out of the fridge, I would say at least 12 hours before that baking process or that cooking process is going to start. So I try to just remember those things. Like if I'm going to bake the bread tomorrow, I'm going to bring my starter out of the fridge today, feed it today, get it nice and happy and at sort of room temperature before I use it in a recipe. So depending on how much of the starter you're using and how much volume you'll require through the week, that will determine how much you feed it. There's a couple of rules. Well, really only one rule. You want to feed it, you can't feed it any more than half of its total volume. So I kind of eye it out. I say I've got about a half a cup in there. I wouldn't want to feed it any more than a quarter of a cup of flour and water as a combined, so that you're building up the volume and you're not overtaking the active bacteria that's in your starter with fresh flour and water to a certain ratio. So I just kind of measure a bit out. I'm going to feed it now. Again, cold tap water. And I'm just going to feed about 75 grams of water and 75 grams of all-purpose flour. Okay, it's about. I'll just move my scale aside. And then I'm just going to mix this together. Make sure you get all the stuff on the sides off so you don't have kind of like sort of crusty bits kind of hanging around. It's all mixed together. Okay, so you can see it's just all mixed together, but not too much, so you're not overworking the gluten. And then this can stay out on the counter for, you know, a couple more hours before you put it back in the fridge again until you're ready to use it. Okay, so we're going to start the baking of the sourdough bread tomorrow. In order to do that, you need to have a levain ready that sits out for 24 hours. So this is the process of making the levain. So what you'll need is a big bowl or some kind of glass jar, something like what I have here. Metal will work if that's all you have, but preferably glass is the best option. So you put in 75 grams. You'll need a scale for this as well. 75 grams of water. This is just cold tap water, is fine. Okay. 75 grams of an all-purpose flour. Okay. And 75 grams of your starter. Probably a good idea to feed this maybe 40 minutes before you're going to start the levain. I usually take this out the night before I'm going to bake, feed it, kind of let it sit out at room temperature a little bit, and then you can make the levain from there. So 75 grams of your active starter. That's a little bit. So I went up to 80, so no big deal. Like if you pour a little bit more in there, it's not a big issue. You can add a little scoop more flour and another pinch of water, and that's fine. Okay. So I've got equal parts of the water, cold tap water, your starter, active starter, and an all-purpose flour. And then I'm just going to mix this together with a fork in my clean glass bowl. Just until all the lumps of the flour are gone. Okay. So I can move all that away. So that's the levain. Now this has to activate on its own. So sort of think of it as feeding a starter to make the bread. Like this is already your starter, but this is going to be the actual activation of the yeast that you're making to make the bread. I cover it tightly with saran wrap. Okay, and then I usually just put on the top with a magic marker what time I started the levain. So this is, we'll just say 11:45 a.m. So that way tomorrow when I go to use this, I know what time, I remembered what time I did it, and as long as it stays out for 24 hours, then you can use that to start the process of the bread making. Now that our leaven has sat for somewhere between 16 and 24 hours, it's ready to go. You can see that it's nice and bubbly, it's very alive. This is the yeast base to actually make the dough. So to your leaven, you're going to add 375 grams of cold water. I mix this together first, just to make sure that the leaven is combined into this liquid. The tool that I'm using here is a little dough hook, I guess, or a dough turner. I find it works well, but you can use a fork. Once you've got the water in there, we're just going to tear out the scale again. And now we're adding 700 grams of all-purpose flour. It just all goes in at once. All the turning of the bread and the mixing of the bread happens in this bowl, or this large measuring cup, which I'm using here. If you don't have something that's glass, you can use something that's metal, but glass is best, and preferably something that has tall sides. You'll see when we get into the turning of the bread that it's important to have something that is a little bit deeper. So I'm just going to take that off the scale. And I'm just going to start to incorporate the flour into the water and leaven mixture. There's no salt at this point because you want to make sure that you're getting a good rise off of that initial fermentation. We'll add salt in stage 2 of this process, which you'll see in the next video. Now you see it looks quite dry and shaggy. If this becomes difficult to use, you can get in there with your hands. But it's okay that it's shaggy because you're going to add water again to this and mix it through, and you'll see after this initial resting period that it will start to come together. You just want to make sure that there's no big pockets of flour, but you're not worried that it's not completely combined. Okay, so I'm just checking the bottom to make sure that there's no flour sitting at the bottom of this dish. Clean off my hook. Make sure it's all down off of the sides. And we'll just cover this with saran wrap again. And this will sit on your counter for 40 minutes. Okay, so now that we've let that part of the dough sit for 40 minutes, I'm just going to uncover it. I'm going to save this saran wrap. We can use that again. In this container, I have 18 grams of kosher salt and 30 to 35 grams of warm water. I just used warm water just to help dissolve the salt a little bit. It's important that you use kosher salt for this. Iodized salt is twice as salty as kosher salt, and it'll change the taste of your bread. It will make it too salty. So just make sure that you're using kosher salt for that. So basically I'm just going to pour the water and the salt mixture into the dough that we've already created. And I'm just going to kind of squeeze it in there. So I'm not being really delicate. I'm just making sure that there's no flour pockets sitting on the bottom, and just making sure that I'm getting the water mixed thoroughly into this dough. Okay, so once it starts to kind of come together like that, you can just kind of turn it in on itself a couple of times, just so that it's all kind of together. Okay, and then we'll cover it again, and we'll let that sit for another 30 minutes. We've let it sit for half an hour now after we've added the salt and water mixture. So now we're going to start with our first turn. You're actually going to turn this dough 6 separate times in 30-minute increments. This is the first turn. So you can do it one of 2 ways. You can either do it with this tool, which is sort of a dough folder or hook or whatever, or you can do it with your hands. I just recommend getting your hand wet first. So what you're going to do to turn it is you're going to come around the bottom of the dough and just lift the bottom up over it, and then again keep sort of turning it around. Okay, sort of press it into itself a little bit. 4 turns. That's it. And then we're going to leave it, cover it again for another 30 minutes, and then we'll turn it again. So we've let the bread rest for half an hour, and I'm just going to uncover it, and we're going to do turn number 2. So I'm going to show you how to use this time, just so you can see the difference. So basically I'm just coming around the side and sort of pushing it down onto itself, turning, same idea here. And same idea here. 4 corners, okay? And then you can just kind of leave it. You'll notice that the bread over the 6 turns will start to change consistency and volume and texture. I'll just cover it up again. It sits for another half an hour, and that was turn 2. This is turn number 5. As you can see, the dough has really started to increase in volume. It's got a softer, more uniform texture and consistency. So we're just going to turn that one more time. I'm just going to wet my hand with a little bit of water so that it doesn't stick. Okay, and then we'll do our turns again. If you happen to have left it for, you know, an extra 10 minutes or 15 minutes and you notice that there's a lot of air in it, you can sort of punch it out a little bit, but you don't want to handle it too much during the turning process. Okay, so that's turn number 5. We'll come back and show you turn number 6, and then the final bench rest before we form the loaves. This is going to be the 6th turn. I'm just going to hold the side of the bowl up to the camera a little bit. Hopefully you can see some of the air pockets that have developed. So it's really grown in volume, and it's got a nice smooth texture, but it's still quite wet and sticky as it should be. So I'm just going to use my tool for this turn so I don't have to get my hands in it. Okay, and I'm just kind of punching down the air a little bit because it's gotten a little bit fluffy. Okay, so that's 6 turns, and we'll let that sit for another half an hour, and then we'll come back and do the bench rest. Now we've finished our last and final turn, our 6th turn. So that's been a 3-hour process. You can see that the dough has really risen, probably by double since the first time we added the water and salt mixture. It's still quite sticky. You can see that if my hands aren't watered, it's still quite sticky. Okay, you want it to be that sticky. I just want to talk about the bench rest a little bit and the type of flour that we're going to be using to complete the rest of the bread making process. So what you want to do is get yourself some rice flour. Hopefully you can see this on camera. This one is rice flour and this one is all-purpose flour, and you can see that the all-purpose flour is really quite soft and quite fine, more like a powder. It'll absorb into the bread, into the dough. That you don't want that because that'll just add extra gluten and it'll make the dough tough. What you want is this rice flour that's like more sandy in texture. Okay, so this will help keep the moisture in the dough through the baking process, so you get all those nice bubbles and its structure stays soft and chewy in the middle. So I'm just going to add a little bit of this rice flour down onto my countertop. Okay, put a little bit through my hands so it doesn't stick. I've got a flexible sort of spatula bench scraper. I'm just going to pull the dough out of the bowl. So you can see that it's quite airy and quite sticky. You don't really need to do much at this point. We're just gonna make sure that it's just all together and kind of knead it just a couple of times. And then we're gonna turn it out onto our floured surface, cover it with a towel, and let that rest for an additional 20 to 30 minutes. We've let the dough rest on the table, the bench rest process of the bread making, for about a half an hour now. So what we're going to do just before I form it into the loaf, I'm just going to kind of move it aside a little bit. I'm going to show you that I have these 2 baskets that I form each loaf into. This is called a banneton. It's sort of a wooden basket. You coat it with flour. The dough sits in here and rises in here before you flip it out to bake it. I'll show you that process after, but I just want to show you how I prepare the banneton for the dough. So I just flour really liberally with that rice flour on the sides, just so that the dough doesn't stick in here. This is part of the reason that you use the rice flour, is because this rice flour, once the dough comes out, is really easy to brush off the dough. The dough's quite wet, as you'll notice when you're doing this process, so using the all-purpose flour really won't work as well. If it's all you have, you can make it work, but you'll have to flour probably more than you think is necessary. So you can see I'm using quite a bit of the rice flour here. So really well coated along the sides and the bottoms of all those ridges so that it gets, your bread doesn't stick. I'm just gonna use a bench scraper to kind of scrape away some of that excess flour. So now we have our dough. So we really don't want to do too much to it at this point. We're mostly just forming it, but I am gonna cut it sort of 2/3 in this larger round banneton and 1/3 of it in this sort of more oval shaped banneton. So I'm just going to kind of eye that out a little bit. Okay, so if that makes sense. This one is going to go in the round one and this one's going to go in the rectangular one. So I'm just going to knock out some of the bigger air pockets. I'm not working it too much here. Basically just to make it into that round shape. Okay, and then I'm going to invert it so that the pretty side is up, and I can just pinch together. If there's any holes, I can just pinch those together, no big deal. I'm going to put a little bit of extra flour on the top, and that's going to get covered with a cloth, and we'll set that aside. This one for the rectangular one is a little bit of a different forming technique, so what I do is flatten it out a smidge, And then I roll up with my fingers, sort of pinching it in onto itself, like this. Okay. And then again, sort of pretty side down. I can pinch that seam together a little bit if it's starting to come apart. And then put a little bit of flour on top. This one has a cute little sort of cover for it. And just make sure that that's snug. So we've got our 2 bread doughs sitting in our banneton. What you can do from this point is either leave this out on your countertop for 2 to 3 hours, depending on the temperature of your house, before you bake it. Or you can let it sit overnight in your refrigerator for a slower fermentation. It'll give you a more sour, chewy, or texture in the finished loaf if you do that. Either way works fine. I'm going to put mine in the fridge overnight for 24 hours, and we'll bake tomorrow and show you the finished product. The 2 loaves that we prepared last night have been sitting in the fridge now for about 20 hours. So up to 24 hours is the maximum amount of time that you want to let it sort of slow ferment in the fridge, as opposed to on your counter if you're going to do that process. I just want to talk about a couple of things quickly before we get into the actual baking of the bread. So because this was in the fridge, I had to allow it to sit out to room temperature. It's been out of the fridge now for about 3 hours. But that will depend on the temperature of your house. So I would say somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 3 hours, until it sort of feels more room temperature but still cool to the touch. And it's risen a little bit. You can see that this one's kind of broken apart a little bit on the seam. That's totally fine, don't worry about that. You won't see that side when it bakes. I also just want to talk quickly about the pans that I'm using for the baking. These really work best. You can use a pizza stone, but I found that the cast iron with the lid really creates the steam that you need to keep the sourdough chewy inside and the crust crispy. So I have one here that's round that this loaf will go into, and then I have another one that's rectangular. So I couldn't find a lid to this one, so basically what I did was I bought 2 of the identical pan, and I just, once I put the loaf in there to bake, I just put the other pan on top so that mimics the lid. So I'm going to preheat my oven now to 475. If you have convect bake or just a bake, you might want to adjust that temperature depending on your oven. I do have a convection feature in my oven, so I do it at 475 to start. So we're just going to preheat the oven, and then I'll come back and I'll show you how to put the loaves in. I've preheated the oven to 475 with the cast iron pans in there. I'm just going to show you how to turn out the loaves. So this is hot, it's very hot. Just going to do the rectangular one first. So you can see that I've got my, can't really see that very well. You can see I've got my bread here. I'm just going to tip it out onto my hand. I do this over the sink so I don't get flour everywhere. And I just brush off a little bit of the flour, and then I'm going to place it gently into the pan. Now don't worry if you have to, the pan is hot, so you don't need to touch it, but don't worry if it doesn't seem to fit quite right. And then I've got a really sharp razor blade or a knife, whatever you have access to. I've used an X-Acto knife. I've cleaned it up and I've put a little bit of tape on the other side just so I can hold it. And I'm going to make 3 or 4 pretty deep cuts, a lot deeper than you think. I'm actually going down quite a fair way. Okay. And then I'm just going to grab the other part of my pan, and I just tip this over, line up the edges, and I'll put that in the oven while I grab the round one. Okay, so again, it's very hot, and I'm just going to grab my round loaf. Again, I just tip it out onto over my sink. so I don't get the flour everywhere. You can see that the Banneton gives it this really nice sort of ridging on the outside. You'll see that more when it bakes. But again, I'm just going to make some deep cuts in the side. This is really important. It allows for the loaf to expand and not crack along the bottom. Okay, so you can see that again that the cuts are pretty deep. Okay, you can do this in any pattern that you like. There's different ways to cut the top. You can look at patterns that you like and do whatever you find looks nice. And then again, I'll put the lid on. So that goes into my oven at 475 for 15 minutes. And then we remove the lid, and I'll show you that part as well. Hi, timer just went off. I'm going to pull the two pans out of the oven just so you can see what they look like at this stage. So you can see that this one's gotten quite large, and you can see the cuts are doing their job and allowing the loaf to expand properly. And that one as well has gotten quite big, and you can see the cuts on the top. So these are going to go back into the oven at a lower temperature of 425 for an additional 15 to 18 minutes. Probably more like 15 for this one and more like 18 for the bigger round loaf. You can go darker if you like, but I'll show you my finished process when we pull them out once the timer goes off. Hi there, the timer just went off, and this one loaf came out about 2 minutes earlier than the bigger round loaf. This is what this one looks like coming out of the oven. So I'm just gonna pop it out of there onto a cooling rack. So those are the two finished loaves. You can see that the cuts have really made a nice pattern on this one. A little bit less on this one because it's a bit of a tighter loaf, but that's okay. I usually bake this one a little bit softer than I do this one anyways. And if you can hear, the bottom is got that hollow sound, and it's got some nice color on it. Like I said before, if you want to go a little bit darker on this and just darken up the ears on these cuts, you're welcome to do that. Now that the loaves have cooled, I just want to cut into one of them just to show you the structure on the inside. So I'll just move this aside a little bit. Cut into this one here on the end. So you can see it's nice and crispy on the outside, chewy in the middle. Okay, so the structure is good. It's baked all the way through. It's nice and chewy. There's some nice good air pockets in the middle there. Looks really good. Again, like I said, you can go darker if you prefer a more crunchy exterior. It toasts up really nice, but it's always best to eat it fresh the day of baking.